Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. It's time for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll be reading Chapter 7 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Lucky number 7. Let's catch up with Don. Chapter 7. Bernie and I kept in touch as our lives and careers followed very different paths. By 1971, he'd split from the Burritos and was working with a series of bands, including one gig he did with Linda Ronstadt. He liked Linda and her producer John Bolin, and he was glad for the work. For this one gig at Disneyland in Anaheim, his fellow musicians were three young men he had met at various locations, including the Troubadour in L.A. Bernie had the best track record of them all. After his experiences with the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers and the Burritos, the others were relative unknowns, Randy Meisner, Don Henley, and Glenn Frey. Henley and Frey being the driving force, and the ones who were later to recognize what a rare combination of talent their group had. Randy Meisner, known to all as Mize, was a shy young singer and bass player from Scottsbluff, Nebraska, the son of sharecroppers. He'd married his childhood sweetheart at 15 and had a son. In 1963, he kissed them goodbye and moved to L.A. with a band called the Soul Survivors, later renamed The Poor because that is what they had become. Randy joined up with Richie Furay and Jim Meisner of the recently disbanded Buffalo Springfield and formed Poco. Randy passed the audition that a young bassist called Timothy B. Smith failed, but Smith later replaced Randy when he quit Poco over musical differences. Randy then joined his musical hero Ricky Nelson in the Stone Canyon Band and did some session work on James Taylor's Sweet Baby James album before getting homesick and giving up music altogether to work at the John Deere tractor plant so he could be with his wife and family. In 1971, Rick Nelson invited him back to L.A., and he decided to give his career one last try. Don Henley moved to L.A. from Texas with his band Shiloh, bankrolled by country singer Kenny Rogers. After a false start with Amos Records, the band broke up. The fuzzy-haired Henley, with his sandpaper voice, soon became part of the furniture at the Troubadour, a former folk club on the corner of Santa Monica Boulevard in Doheny in Hollywood. It was a magnet for rock musicians, folk singers, and songwriters, where the likes of Neil Young and Linda Ronstadt would regularly hold court in the corner and plot their dreams. Glenn Frey, a natural R&B guitarist and singer, whose idol was Bob Seger, had moved to L.A. from Detroit and teamed up with a talented musician and songwriter named John David Souther, or J.D. They wrote songs together, and in 1969 formed the duo Long Branch Penny Whistle. Their first album, put out on Amos Records, flopped. They shared an apartment complex with singer-songwriter Jackson Browne for a while, and by 1970, Frey decided he wanted a solo career. A huge Elvis fan, he dubbed himself the Teen King. David Geffen, an up-and-coming promoter and future record company executive with people like Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, urged him to stick with the group. Recalling the Anaheim gig with Ronstadt and hoping to recapture the magic of that night, Frey and Henley approached Meisner and Bernie Leadon about forming their own group. The move was, one of them once said, born of a mix of desperation, fear, and insecurity. They realized they played well together, but they only knew each other socially over a few beers and had no idea how they'd all get along. They signed up with David Geffen and his newly formed record label Asylum, created as the antithesis of the cigar-smoking men in suits who had previously run the record industry. What they needed first and foremost was a name. The Doors, the Byrds, and the Beatles had all done well with something short and concise. Glenn Frey, the Detroit-born, would be James Dean of the band. He wanted something that sounded punchy, like a teen gang out of West Side Story. On a combination of peyote tea and tequila out in the Mojave Desert one night, Bernie recounted from a Carlos Castenda book that the Hopi Indians revered the eagle above all other animals because it flies closest to the sun and has a great moral spirit. The Eagles were born. They may have barely known each other, but by the spring of 1972, just when I was at my lowest ebb in Boston, they were in England recording their debut album, Eagles, with Glenn Johns, the producer of classic works by the Rolling Stones, The Who, Traffic, Led Zeppelin, and Steve Miller. It was an uneasy relationship, made harder by John's perfectionism, his anti-drug stance, and several differences of opinion as to how much of a country flavor the music should have. Despite the early tensions, within a few months their special mix of country and rock gave them a record in the top 10. That summer they toured with an odd assortment of British bands including Yes, Jethro Tull, and Procol Harum, and they dominated the top 40 with 3 hit singles: Take It Easy, written by Jackson Browne and Glenn Frey, Witchy Woman, written by Bernie and Don Henley, and Peaceful Easy Feeling by songwriter Jack Tempchin. Each number captured the laid-back, anything-is-possible culture of the time and found the emotional resonance with every idealistic teenager who had ever dreamt of a summer cruising chicks in a convertible. The Eagles' chart rivals like Harry Nilsson, Don McLean, and Roberta Flack didn't stand a chance. I kept hearing Take It Easy on the car radio in shops, diners, and gas stations before anyone had really ever heard of the Eagles. Bernie's distinctive banjo playing filled the background, and every time I heard it, I smiled. I felt so proud. On Witchy Woman, his eerie guitar chords sounded like something the Hopi Indians would have performed a ritual dance to. When the Eagles came to Boston in 1972, as an opening band for Yes, Bernie called me up. "Hey Don," he said, "I'm coming to town next week playing at Boston University for one night only with this new band. Why don't you bring Susan over and come and meet the guys? We can have a bit of a jam. I'll put your names on the guest list." "Sounds great," I said, delighted to hear Bernie's voice again and to know that my old buddy hadn't forgotten me. "See you there." If Susan had any reservations about my going to see yet another old friend, doing so much better than me, she didn't say a word. We traveled to the university campus in our trusty Volvo, and sure enough, Bernie had pulled it off so that we walked straight in past the security guards. "Hey man, good to see you," he beamed, the same old grin lighting up his whole face as he patted me warmly on the back of the dressing room door. He hardly looked a day older than when he had met me off the Greyhound bus nearly 10 years earlier. Turning to Susan, he embraced her. "Hey, Mrs. Felder, congratulations. You finally snared him, huh?" Susan then kissed Bernie almost shyly, and they talked for a while about old times and whether either of them still heard from Bernie's old flame, Judy Lee. Stepping inside the dressing room the band shared, we came face to face with a bunch of young, fresh-looking guys, likable, bright-eyed with trademark long hair, jeans, football shirts, and cowboy boots. They were exactly like most of the musicians I hung out with every day in the studio. "Hey everyone," Bernie announced. "I'd like you to meet Don Felder, the man with the lightest fingers I know on a Stratocaster." "Hey, Fingers," said a square-jawed man I was introduced to as Glenn Frey. He shook me firmly by the hand and introduced me to curly-haired Don Henley, who seemed a little uptight. I put it down to pre-show nerves, and Randy Meisner, who looked like a shy, baby-faced boy. There didn't seem to be a clear leader, although I noticed that Glenn seemed the most confident and was the one who stepped up to make the introductions. They were just a young band, starting out, playing to crowds of 1,000 or 2,000, driving themselves around in rental cars between various indoor facilities like college campuses and small old theaters. They seemed to be having a lot of fun while they were doing it too, from what Bernie had told me. All but Randy were single and were clearly enjoying the drink and the drugs and the girls that seemed to go with the territory. They played marathon poker games, knocked a basketball around on weekends, had pet nicknames for each other, and often socialized together. At the time, it felt to me, there was no special aura about them, no sense that they were going to do any better than any of the other bands we had all tried our hand in. They were just a bunch of guys making music together. I felt completely at ease. As it turns out, later they had 3 hits on their first album. "Want a jam?" Bernie asked, passing me an electric guitar that was leaning against the table in the corner. "Sure," I grinned, sitting astride a packing case next to him while Susan settled down on a cushion on the floor. Bernie opened with a piece of bluegrass he and I had played in Gainesville together 100 times before, and I fell right in. It felt good to be playing with him again. Up until that moment, I don't think I'd ever realized how much I'd missed his incredible musical gifts. Pulling a worn bottleneck from my pocket and placing it over my left middle finger, I played some slide on the next number we did, and before long everyone in the room was foot-tapping and clapping their hands in time. The room was filled with long-neck buds that were drained in quick succession. We were having a good time. Susan sat looking up at me with such love and admiration as Bernie and I went into a rousing finale. I felt truly blessed to have her for my wife and him for my best friend. This was what it was all about, the ability to sit down and create something out of nothing, to be surrounded by friends and people you love, and to fill the room with music. I never wanted to lose sight of that. When we were through, the room went wild. Several people had wandered into the dressing room from down the corridor to listen to us play, and the place was packed. Bernie threw his head back and laughed at the sheer pleasure of it, and I felt happier than I had in months. Glenn Fry came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Man, you're good," he said, clearly impressed. "You should come to L.A. We could use a few more players like you out there." Bernie interjected. "You're on to a loser there. I've been trying to get Don to head west for 10 years. I keep telling him that's where it's happening, but he won't listen and he won't leave his lady." I said nothing. I just shrugged my shoulders while Susan watched us pensively a few feet away. When it was the band's turn to go on stage, she and I stood in the wings watching them play. They were very good, really tight together as a classical 4-part harmony band, although maybe a little bit too static and country for me. No movement, no gimmicks, no political messages about Nixon's re-election, or the latest atrocities in Vietnam, or the quest for world peace. They just stood and played their music. If there was any talking to be done, and there wasn't much, then Glenn did it. He was up front behind the hidden mic, his long hair swaying, singing lead. Don sat way at the back, hidden behind the drums, singing at the same time as drumming, which is a phenomenally difficult double act to carry off in terms of physical coordination. Only Levin Helms from the band had really done it well before. Just once on Witchy Woman, Don sang lead, and he was surprisingly good. He had a clean, clear rasp to his voice that cut through the air like a knife. Overall, I decided that I liked them better personally than I did musically. Where I came from, country music was considered rather inferior, a backwoods sort of thing that the rednecks from the deep south listened to with their rifles and shotguns in the back of their pickup trucks and the coon dogs on the front porch. Although I had grown up on a diet of the Grand Ole Opry, I felt I had moved beyond that, into a combination of free-form jazz, rhythm and blues, and good old rock and roll. I was still very interested in English music, and was far more eager to hear Yes than I was the Eagles. I would never have rushed out and bought an Eagles album. Instead, I'd have put my hard-earned cash on the latest by Fleetwood Mac, Hendrix, or Eric Clapton. To give the Eagles their due, there was something spine-tinglingly magical about their sound, and I liked the fact that they all sang. Other than the Beach Boys and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, there were a few other bands really doing that. Even in the Beatles, Ringo barely sang, and George was just sort of in the background. What these boys did in its simplicity and uniqueness was really cool. It was intelligible. You could understand the lyrics very easily, and each of them brought something to the party. Glenn was the lead singer, and Don sang great harmonies and played drums way behind the beat, giving an anticipatory tension to the music. I don't think it's something that he did consciously or willingly. It was just where he felt the beat and became part of the Eagles' groove. Bernie played mean 5-string banjo, mandolin, and pedal steel, while Randy played bass and contributed the most edgy, high-pitched harmonies with his angelic voice. It was a combination that worked, although I'm not sure how truly appreciative the crowd that had come to see Yes was about, an all-American, all-singing country rock band. It seemed like a slightly odd pairing to me. Yes, they were mind-blowing. We watched their progressive rock symphony from the wings and were mightily impressed. They had such a distinctive sound, and the crowd went wild. John Anderson's voice was crystal, Steve Howe was a fine guitarist, and Rick Wakeman was amazing on keyboards. I felt privileged to have been able to hear them play. Susan and I went back to Bernie's hotel room after the gig and hung out with him for a couple hours. The band was leaving early the next morning in their fleet of rental cars, heading for the next town. Their road manager, Richie Fernandez, would sit in the lead car with a map, navigating his little convoy across America. Bernie had to be up at dawn, and Susan and I were both working the next day, so we didn't stay late. "I'll see you around, pal," I told Bernie with some sadness as I shook his hand. "Yeah, sure. Maybe even in California, huh?" he joked, knowing how I stood on that particular issue. Giving Susan a squeeze, he mumbled into her hair. "You should let Don go to L.A., you know, just to prove himself that he can do it. You'd never look back, either of you." An idea can grow in your head like a seed. Planted by Bernie 10 years earlier, nurtured over the years, and watered liberally by our latest encounter, the thought of moving to California and trying to make a go of it developed into a full-fledged organism in my brain. Bernie was living proof of what could happen. Airplay on national radio, a tour with a famous country rock band, musical success, and with it, fulfillment and happiness. The whole music scene in Los Angeles had really blossomed from the Mamas and the Papas and the Beach Boys, evolving into something acknowledged by the world as unique. Before then, most American music came out of the East Coast, Detroit, or Atlanta. The concept of moving west wasn't so scary anymore either. I had left Gainesville, lived in New York, and seen a bit of the States. I had encountered drugs on a daily basis and had not been lured into a heroin addiction, as all the teenage propaganda had warned me I would. My career in Boston was going nowhere. I could suddenly see that what Bernie said made sense, and I knew where I had to go. The hard part would be convincing Susan. "Honey, maybe Bernie's right," I ventured cautiously one morning over breakfast. "Maybe I should go out to L.A. for a while and take a look around. I could hop on a train and leave you here with your parents and your job and the apartment for a while until I find some work, and then I could send for you." Susan glared at me from across the table. I knew what was coming. She didn't want to leave Boston, and she didn't want to live in California. I braced myself for the outburst. "No way," she said firmly. "If you think I'm letting you loose on all those California girls on your own, you've smoked more weed than is good for you. If you go, I go." Within 2 months of meeting the Eagles at Boston University, we had made the decision. I called Bernie and told him, and he promised to make some inquiries about session or band work for me. "I can't believe you're finally coming, man," he laughed over the telephone line. "Get your butt out here, Don. You'll never regret it." I handed him my notice at my various jobs, and Susan left Harvard. We held a yard sale and sold our furniture and most of our clothes. I decided to sell my beloved gold Les Paul I had bought from a jazz session player in Boston. I took it to New York, where I hoped to get a better price for it. I went into several guitar shops, but the best I was offered was $150. Susan took me by the hand and led me outside the last shop we tried. "Don't sell it, Dawn," she said. "I know how much you love it. We don't need the money that bad." So I kept it, and now it's worth several $100,000. We went to U-Haul and rented the largest trailer they had to attach to the back of our old 6-cylinder Volvo. Whatever we couldn't fit in, we sold or gave away. We had saved exactly $1,000 in cash, which we hid in the car, but we had no clue how we'd manage for money once that ran out. Undaunted, we packed our clothes, musical instruments, kitchen equipment, and of course, Kilo, our dog, said an emotional goodbye to friends and family, and set off. It was the summer of 1972, and we were headed 3,000 miles across America for the City of Angels, to what seemed like the promised land, chasing an impossible dream. I felt heady with excitement and fear. This was it, my last chance. If I didn't make it in California, I was going to have to give myself a real job. My whole future lay before me like a rug. Tentatively, I prepared to cross it. Driving across America with Susan toward the mystic landscape of California was all that I'd hoped it would be, and more. The last time I'd taken the road west, I'd been 9 years old, standing up and hanging onto a rope in the back of my dad's 1942 Chevy. Now I was 25, with a guitar in the back of my car, and a beautiful wife by my side, who was prepared to give up everything she knew and loved just to hold my hand on this big adventure. We were so crazy about each other, we felt indestructible. On the long journey coast to coast across America, the cheap motels and diners we found along the way didn't eat into our savings too badly. Kilo sat in the back like a silent hitchhiker, hanging his head out the rear window for air, the wind lifting his big floppy ears. We headed southwest and traveled the nearly 3,000 miles in marathon shifts, taking turns at the wheel. The Volvo dash was such that Susan couldn't rest her left foot up on it while cruising, so she did her share of the driving conventionally. Those endless highways, with little to distract or entertain, rekindled some nostalgic memories of Jerry and me and Mom and Dad driving across America in those rose-tinted days when we all got along. Our journey felt symbolic. We were following the trail carved by thousands of prospectors before us, heading west for gold, through the Rockies, through deserts and prairies, under open skies and towering cacti, toward fertile valleys full of orange groves, offering the chance of a better life. Jack Kerouac had defined the notion of crossing America in his 1957 book On the Road, but for Susan and me, the passage was even more spiritual. It was the first real test of our marriage, and we had come through it. In a lesser relationship, I could have gone off to L.A. alone and never sent for her, or she could have chosen never to have come. My final stab for musical success might well end up in disaster, but my wife believed in me enough to abandon her own hopes and wishes in support of mine. We arrived in L.A. travel-weary, and Susan somehow navigated us through the maze of freeway spaghetti that surrounds the city until we were on Highway 10 headed for Topanga Canyon, a remote area in the Santa Monica Mountains to the far northwest where Bernie lived. His address at Skyline Drive turned out to be just what it said. It could only be reached by a series of dramatic snake turns on narrow mountain roads with no guardrails between us and oblivion. It were almost impossible to negotiate with an old Volvo pulling a trailer. I didn't even know if the brakes still worked. There hadn't been much call for them in Boston. We drove up and up until we could go no more, and finally we reached Bernie's little one-bedroom house right on the peak of the canyon with the most amazing view across L.A. from downtown to Catalina. "Hey guys, how you doing?" He greeted us with a grin as he opened the door. "You made it! Great! Come on in." In the hallway right behind him was a suitcase and a backpack ready for loading into his car. "Going somewhere?" I asked. "Yeah, oh, sorry man, didn't I tell you?" he said, scratching his corkscrew curls. "I'm going on the road with the Eagles tomorrow." "For how long?" I said, anxious about finding work and being in L.A. without knowing a single solitary soul. "Just a couple of weeks," he said, "but make yourselves at home. You and Susan can crash on the floor until you find a place of your own. If I were you, I'd start looking tomorrow. That floor is pretty unforgiving." Trying to get comfortable on an assortment of lumpy cushions on a hardwood floor that night, I couldn't sleep for worrying what I'd brought Susan to. I'd made her give up her well-paid, rewarding job at Harvard and travel clear across the country to sleep on someone's floor with a guitar-playing loser who had no work and even fewer prospects. I finally drifted off, exhausted by our long drive, only to be woken at dawn by Kilo whimpering piteously in the corner. Just as I was about to tell him to be quiet, there was the strangest of sensations. The glass in the window rattled in its frame, and then there was a sound like someone knocking violently on the front door. Within seconds, the entire house was shuddering in great spasms, from the roof shingles to the nails in the floorboards. Susan and I clung to each other for dear life, wondering what was happening. When it finally stopped, after what seemed like forever, Bernie came running out of his bedroom, wearing only his underpants. "Hey, did you feel that?" he said, his eyes bright. "That was a big one." "What was it?" Susan asked, her face ashen as Kilo scurried to her for comfort. "It was an earthquake," he exclaimed, laughing at her ignorance. "Welcome to California." We found a crummy little second-floor apartment in a Hispanic section of Culver City, just off Washington Boulevard, at a cost of $110 a week. It was furnished, but had no yard, and dogs weren't allowed. Once we'd unloaded the U-Haul and moved Kilo into a back bedroom where the landlord couldn't see him, we started trying to make it like everyone else in L.A. Susan found a job working as the secretary and bookkeeper for a wholesale food company. I cut off some of my hair and greased it back to try to look respectable. Wearing a jacket and tie, I went to the Manpower Secretarial Agency and told them I could type. "How are you with the IBM Selectric?" "Fluent," I heard myself lie. "Well, how hard could it be when you could play a few musical instruments and had worked in studios?" I made up some companies I'd worked for in Boston, using part of the real names of the studios. Ace Trucking, AAA Recruitment, and the agency eventually sent me to IBM. I lied on my employee information form and was given a job packing training manuals for their latest computer products. I also took a second job running a photocopying machine for an accounting firm. The combined pay was just enough to pay the rent. In the evenings, I toured the bars and clubs and picked up a few jobbing gigs. Bernie came back from tour and started to make some inquiries for me about work. Through the grapevine, he had heard that J.D. Souther, Glenn Frey's songwriting companion from Long Branch Penny Whistle, was looking for a guitarist to go out on the road with him. J.D. had just put out a solo album called John David Souther on Elektra Records, on which Glenn had played guitar. He was also working closely with fellow Geffen protégés Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and Jackson Browne. I went along for the audition, nervous as and it showed. My performance wasn't that great, and furthermore, I couldn't play pedal steel, and they needed someone who could. They hired a guy named Ed Black instead, and went on the road without me. Then Bernie told me that Terry Lee, an English singer and guitarist, whom I had heard play and who had been likened to Clapton, but with a better voice, was looking for someone for a new album. "Great," I said. "Where do I find him?" "They're rehearsing over at Studio Instrument Rentals in Hollywood," Bernie told me. "Get your butt over there." Bernie loves saying that, doesn't he? So it was a rehearsal hall I already knew well. The Eagles often rehearsed there, and whenever they did, Bernie would call me up and invite me to drop by and jam with them. He, Glenn, and I would have a blast playing music and hanging out. In those days, studios had no security, and musicians would just open the door, walk in, and sit down. With my guitar and amp in hand, I did just that. Once I found out exactly which studio Terry Lee was rehearsing in. Without introducing myself or saying a word, I walked in while his band was playing on stage, plugged my guitar and amp in, and was ready to play. The band stopped playing. "Hey man, what you doing?" one of the sound engineers asked. Terry Lee stared at me incredulously. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name's Don Felder," I said. "I've heard you play, and I think you're a great singer, and I want to play for you." Terry Lee stared at me for a moment, then smiled. "Okay, Don Felder, let's hear what you can do." For the next hour I played for them and jammed with them, and we got on really well musically. Finally, the session ended, and they told me, ever so politely, that they had already found a lead guitarist and my services weren't required. As they watched in silence, I unplugged the amp, picked up my guitar, and walked out. With my job at IBM, some session work, and Susan working at the food company, we were struggling. But I could sense there were prospects in LA and that I was in the right place for something to happen. I was far more inspired and positive than I had ever felt sitting in Boston making jingles. Kilo was very unhappy, however. There was no yard, and he was left alone in the apartment all day long. Poor Kilo. He came home one day and found he'd shredded one of the cushions in the recliner seat the day before the landlord was coming to pick up his rent, which he did on the 1st of every month. We threw a big sheet over the couch so he couldn't see the damage. When the landlord was on his way over, Susan would either hide Kilo in the back bedroom with the door closed or take him for a long walk. We lived in that apartment for 6 months. Our only friends were our next-door neighbors, a French couple named Marina and Jackie Luady. He was a mechanic with Citroën, and she was a housewife. The first time we met, Marina looked at me and smiled. "You're the one who walks with rhythm," she said. "Pardon me?" I asked. Susan looked at her, askant. "When you walk up the stairs," Marina explained, "you walk with rhythm." She fancied herself as a bit of a mystic and offered to read my tarot cards one afternoon. I agreed, more out of politeness than anything. "It can't hurt," I told Susan. "I mean, what can she tell me?" I went to her apartment as arranged one afternoon and sat down opposite her at a small table. She shuffled the cards and spread them out in front of her. "Oh my God," she said, her accent as thick as butter, as her long fingers ran across the cards one by one. "What?" I asked, concerned, looking helplessly at the table. "What is it?" "You," she said, looking up at me, her green eyes huge. "What about me?" I said, getting a little edgy. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was something terrible she could tell me. Her face broke into an enormous smile. "You, my darling," she said, reaching across the table and squeezing my arm excitedly, "are going to be very famous and very, very wealthy." "Really?" I had asked, wondering if she had had a little too much pear nod. "Absolutely," she nodded firmly. "It's written in the cards." Well, she was right. That's the end of Chapter 7. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 7 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.